The last main component of our cardiovascular system is our blood. So, up to this point, we talked about the pump, talked about the pipes. Now we got to talk about the fluid that flows through all of these structures. That's referred to as blood. It's easy to think that our blood carries oxygen. It's the main overall function of our blood. But we need to break it down into multiple components, because you look at your blood and it's red because the majority of our blood is made up of the red blood cells. But there's other functions such as immune system. So there are different cells that perform the immune functions. And there's actually a medium that all of these things kind of float in. So the plasma is the liquid. This is the medium in which our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets float around in. And this is primarily composed of water. There are other proteins that float around in this that help kind of maintain the blood volume. There are oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen floating around in there, but they're not really useful functionally, just floating in the liquid. There are nutrients such as glucose and other types of nutrients our cells need on a regular basis. And cellular wastes, because again, our cells are doing work constantly and they have to purge their waste product. The main component of our blood, the red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes. They contain a protein known as hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is the oxygen carrying component of our red blood cells. This molecule contains iron in it, which helps bind the oxygen to the hemoglobin. This is a big reason why during pregnancy, prenatal vitamins are important to take, because this provides nutrients for the developing fetus to create hemoglobin, provide enough iron for the hemoglobin to bind the appropriate amount of oxygen. This is also why we do need a specific amount of iron in our diets, because we can't just say, voila, we have iron in our body and make hemoglobin, because it comes out as a waste product each and every time we go to the bathroom. And we need to keep generating adequate amount of red blood cells with hemoglobin. Then we have our white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. These probably make up the smallest percentage of our blood, but they serve the vital function of our immunity. It helps protect us from bloodborne illnesses, infections, bacteria, so on and so forth. There are various different types of white blood cells that have more specific functions. For right now, just think leukocytes help fight infection. And as we progress through, we will actually bring up some issues where we have overreactions from our leukocytes or other issues with our white blood cells. Then the last component are our platelets. Platelets are fragmented cells. They're not full cells. They're broken down and they're just tiny little pieces floating through. The importance of this is to facilitate blood clotting. So if you have a paper cut and you're bleeding and then it stops after a little bit, you have your platelets to thank for that. Because when you have a paper cut, there's a signal that goes out that allows these platelets to stick together and form that clot that prevents further bleeding from that area. It's also known as the blood clot cascade. It's very complicated and there's multiple steps to it. And there are some disorders with it that we will actually go into in a different chapter. So this picture kind of outlines something called a hematocrit. And this is when we take a blood sample, put it in a little capillary tube, and spin it in a centrifuge. And when you spin these components, they actually separate into different layers. So when we spin it, we should see roughly 45% of the length of this tube to be red blood cells. That's the main component. Approximately 1% and sometimes less are the red blood cells. So you can see this tiny white line. It's also known as a Buffy coat, but that is the white blood cells that float around in our blood. Then the rest, the 55%, should be plasma. So the plasma here helps the red and white blood cells and platelets floating around. The main functions of blood is to perfuse organs. Our organs cannot exchange gases if they are not getting an adequate amount of blood. If there's no blood, there's a buildup of waste product that can result in tissue death, and in some cases, organ failure. It also helps transport oxygen, obviously. That's what we imagine blood doing. As I have discussed and brought up multiple times, it's going to carry out carbon dioxide as a waste product and other wastes and nutrients. Then blood clotting and coagulation. So this is just the fancy word for clotting.